Hey everybody, welcome back to Forging an Eternal Legacy Family. Remember the last time we talked about the definition of what a legacy family is. Today, what we want to look at particularly is a model. How do you build that kind of a model for your family and future generations to follow? Now, the cool thing is, realize this, every model is going to look different. There's not a blueprint or design, so to speak, in Scripture that says, hey, your model has to be this way. Because of every one of us are unique individuals with unique gifts, and then you bring individuals together in marriage. Every marriage is unique and reflects God in a different way. Well, that means that your model is going to look different. It depends on your giftedness, your circumstances, your situation, where God has put you at this moment in this time. And so as we go through this, don't be looking for something to necessarily replicate or to imitate. What you want to look for, hey, what are the principles that we use to build an eternal family legacy? And I think a great place to start is with a story from the Old Testament about one couple who created a really incredible model and maybe the best legacy of all.
I love this story. It's a story from the book of Ruth in the Old Testament. And as you said, it starts with one couple, and it starts with Naomi and her husband, Elimelech. And they live in the land of Israel, and they have two boys. And during the time they live, there's a severe famine. And so they leave Israel and they go to the land of Moab. And while they're there, I guess the boys grow up and they marry two Moabite women. Now, ultimately, within the time they're there, which is about 10 years, Elimelech dies, and so do both of the sons. So Naomi then has her two daughter-in-laws. That's what she has left. So she decides she's going to go back to Israel. So she says to her daughter-in-laws, you all stay here. I don't have anything else for you. I'm going back. I don't even have anything there that's left. And very famously, this is one of the famous parts of the story, both sister-in-laws initially say, no, we're going to go with you. But one ultimately ends up staying with their family, and the other, whose name is Ruth, says, please don't ask me anymore not to go with you, because where you go, I'm going to go. And your people are going to be my people, and your God's going to be my God. And so they leave and go back to the land of Israel. Now they go back, they don't really have anything at that point. Ruth takes the initiative, goes out and starts, it's harvest season, the barley harvest season, and so she starts gleaning barley in a field. And it happens that she's in the field of Boaz. Boaz ends up being a distant cousin of Elimelech. Yes, so when Naomi realizes where Ruth is working, she ends up telling her, okay, this is the plan. You need to take off your mourning clothes and get dressed up and smell good. And when the men are at the end of the harvest, when they're going to call it a barn, when they're in the barn laying down tonight, you go in and you find Boaz and you go to the end of his feet, you lift up the covers and you lay down right there.
That's what you did for me, right?
Right, yes, exactly. So she does that. And so Boaz awakens, finds her there, and is like, oh, now what that meant in that culture was, will you marry me? Will you accept me?
It's quite a proposal.
Yes, it was. And so he ends up saying, I will do right by you tomorrow. And so he tells her to scoot on out so no one sees her. And then the next day, what he ends up doing is finding out, is there anyone that's a closer relative that would have had a right to redeem the land, redeem the family land, and marry her? So it happens that there was, but that person turns it down. And so Boaz marries Ruth. Now, I don't think they would have ever imagined the legacy that they were starting.
You know, you hear that story and there's so many things that you could mine out of that story. We want to focus on 4 principles that I think we learn from this story that hopefully we can apply to our own families. First one is, hey, your past is your past. What you've done in the past doesn't determine what you have to do in the future. I can remember someone saying to me, it's never a wrong time to do the right thing.
Good line.
Now, if you're like me, I know there's things in my past that I regret doing, things I wish we had a do-over for. But the reality is we can't. But what we can do is determine to start from today to do right. Now, you look at what this family did, what Elimelech did. First of all, just the whole thing of leaving Israel to go to Moab, who was one of their enemies. God had given them the promised land, and God had promised, hey, if you follow me and serve me, then I'm going to take care of you. And whether it was a lack of trust, whether it was fear, we don't know, but he took his whole family there. And then what did he do? He allowed his sons to marry 2 women from Moab who were traditionally enemies of Israel. We know in the law that God said, hey, you need to marry only another Israelite. Do not marry out of your faith. And they did that. You see all of those mistakes that happened there. And yet God, in spite of those mistakes, God took care of the situation. We know that ultimately God's sovereignty prevailed. I love that idea from 2 Corinthians 5:17. It says, therefore, if anyone is in Christ, a new creation has come. The old is gone, but the new is here. Man, what a way to start or to keep building the legacy God has for you.
As you said a minute ago, the idea of the sovereignty of God, and I think that's the second thing we see here. We see God is at the core of a family legacy, how you build that. God's sovereignty is all over this story, right? It's all over this story. And as you said, we see it evident even when there were probably poor choices that were made. God is still working and weaving.
Isn't that good news for us?
Yes, it's so encouraging. And so you think about, Ruth making the decision to come back with her mother-in-law. She could have easily stayed like her.
Yeah. If that happens to us, I'm not sure I'm going with your mother-in-law. My mother-in-law.
Your
mother.
And so you think about that. When they came back to Israel, it just so happened it was barley harvest time. I love the way it's phrased there. It just so happened. It just so happens that Ruth goes out and works in the field that belongs to Boaz, who just so happens to be related to her former father-in-law. And so we see just throughout the whole story this reminder that God is moving in every one of those details. And it's such a great reminder and encouragement for our lives and our story, that even when there have been things, as you said, that we wish we had a do-over on, God is sovereignly working in and through all those.
Yeah, Paul talked about that in Romans, where he said, man, God works all things together. Even the mistakes we make, even the unwise choices, even the things that other people do that we didn't have anything to do with. Yeah, that God is still going to work everything for our good and for his glory. That's an awesome promise. I think a third characteristic, a third principle we see here is really the importance of godly character. And you got 2 people here, Ruth and Boaz, who are just poster children for people of strong character. I mean, you think about it. Here she is, here Ruth is. She doesn't even know the God of Israel. And yet she chooses to follow her mother-in-law when everything she knew was back there in Moab. And she chose to follow her to a place that was a foreign country and there was an enemy to her. Man, what faithfulness there was that said, I'm not going to leave you. I'm going to continue to go. You see that with her work ethic, how she wasn't going to sit around and hope someone would take care of them. As you said, she went out to the field. She worked, and that was back-breaking work, to bend over and pick up grain that had been left to the sides the way God had commanded the Israelites to do. You see that character in Boaz, who, one, the first thing he noticed about her was her work ethic. Doesn't tell us anything about what she looked like, but it says, who was that woman that is working so hard there? And then when he found out who she was and what she was doing for Naomi, He said, y'all take care of her. Make sure she gets enough grain. Make sure she gets water. That kind of character. And then when he had that crazy wedding proposal, I mean, he could have taken advantage of her in that kind of culture, but instead he chose to do the right thing. I think the coolest thing, though, we see when it comes to character is a word the Old Testament uses called hesed. And what that is, it means a loyal love. It's the kind of love that God has for us, that he had for Israel, that Moses reminded him of when the people failed over and over again. And Moses would intercede and said, God, remember your loyal love. That same word is used for both Ruth and Boaz, a loyal love. So one of our goals as we build this legacy, this eternal legacy for our family, is character is paramount. Our own character and allowing God to transform us, but then making sure that we understand that character and holiness in our children is even higher than other things we might be working towards.
And I think the final principle, and there's more than these probably, but that we'll look at is the idea of boldness and intentionality. And we see that again in the life of Ruth and Boaz also. Again, Ruth, just bold courage, again, to leave her land, come to a new land, a foreign place for her. Intentionality, as you said, she didn't wait around on somebody to come take care of them or feed them. She went out and found work. And she did it very, intentionally, day in and day out to provide for them. The fact that she followed Naomi's plan to go and propose to Boaz. And she did that. She was bold in doing that. Boaz, again, the idea that he intentionally inquired about Ruth and said, who is she? And what's her story? He also, again, boldly, intentionally does the right thing. He follows the process, what would have probably been the law of the land, to find out if in fact he could marry her. So he does the right thing again. So I think that is so cool. I think there's this idea that in every generation, the invisible God becomes visible when God's people are boldly compassionate and caring. And I think we so see that in the lives of these main characters in this story, the evidence of them making God visible.
Going back to something you said about Boaz, and I love that. You talk about intentionality, and we really encourage that with couples we work with all the time. Be intentional about growing your marriage. Be intentional about your relationship with God. Be intentional about how you raise your children. And here's Boaz, and he goes to the other guy who has it right, and he says, hey, would you like to redeem this land? And the guy said, yeah, I'll take more land. And then he throws in, but you got to take Ruth in the package. Even in that, he does it and presents his case in such a way that he knows in the end he's going to win out and that he's going to get Ruth. Man, I love that about Boaz. As we wrap up this session and we think about those principles. Don't let your past hold you back. Don't be stuck in the mistakes that you or other people have made. Look for and trust God's providence. Focus on building godly character, both in yourself and in your children and the generations you have. And the final thing, trust God's sovereignty and providence, that he's going to work everything out. Even when the way may seem impossible to you, trust God that he's got a plan. So many times what you see in the Old Testament is they stopped trusting God. They'd seen him move, they'd seen him work, but they couldn't believe that God would intervene and work for them. All they could see was in front of their eyes, and it looked hard. We talked about Ruth and Boaz having this incredible legacy. And you look in Matthew chapter 1 and you see that. And it starts out, hey, Salmon, the father of Boaz, whose mother was Rahab. If you remember her, one of the prostitute about the spies in Jericho. They had Boaz, and Boaz was the father of Obed, whose mother was Ruth. And Obed, father of Jesse, and Jesse was the father of King David. And David was the father of Solomon, whose mother had been Uriah's wife, and Solomon was the father of Rehoboam. And then 22 generations later, it says Nathan was the father of Jacob, and Jacob the father of Joseph, and Joseph the husband of Mary, and Mary was the mother of Jesus, who's called the Messiah. You know, when Ruth made that choice to follow Naomi, I think she had any idea of the legacy that God was going to build for her and her future husband, who she had no idea of then.
No, and that she would be the line of the Messiah.
And because they were faithful in just following day by day what God called them to do and being obedient to the Father, they became part of the greatest legacy of all. What kind of model are you creating for future generations to follow? Have you been intentional about doing that? Or have you just sort of let things come as they may? If we want to have that eternal family legacy, we got to make sure that we follow God's principles to do that. Man, we hope you enjoy the time of discussion as you think about that and how that applies to your family. And we'll see you the next session of Forging an Eternal Legacy Family.